April 15, 2025, Seligman, Arizona. A 2-year-old boy vanished into the unforgiving Arizona wilderness 5 p.m. A 2-year-old boy vanishes from his home near the edge of the Arizona wilderness. A desperate search begins. Helicopters in the sky. Deputies on foot. Walking an incredible 7 miles through terrain, crawling with coyotes, bears, and mountain lions. But what saved him wasn't just luck. It was this dog. Buford, a quiet ranch guardian who became a legend overnight, rancher Scotty Dunton, was heading to town when he saw something that stopped his heart. I got in my truck and there was Buford walking by the fence with a little blonde kid beside him. The boy had survived the night alone, cold, lost, and scared. But Buford never left his side. He led him through the final stretch, through danger to safety. Today we tell the full story. From the moment the boy went missing, to the unforgettable bond formed between a child and a dog in the wild, Buford. The hero dog who led a child out of the wilderness. A true story. April 2025. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Arizona sky, bleeding soft gold and amber across the jagged horizon. The vastness of the high desert seemed to stretch into forever endless tufts of sagebrush, scattered cacti, and boulders resting like ancient guardians of the land. Wind murmured through the dry grass, rustling gently against the picket fence that bordered the Dunlap family's modest homestead nestled just outside Seligman, a speck on the map known more for its solitude than for visitors. Inside the Dunlap house, a single-story structure worn smooth by time and sun, the clatter of a wooden spoon against a pot echoed softly in the kitchen. Claire Dunlap stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, stirring a pot of baked beans on the stove while glancing through the open window at the setting sun. Her auburn hair was hastily tied into a messy bun strands, sticking to her forehead from the kitchen heat. The air smelled of cumin and smoke, hearty and comforting. "Caleb," she called over her shoulder. "Honey, don't go too far. Mama's making dinner." There was no response, but she wasn't worried. Her 2-year-old son was a wanderer by nature, but never strayed far. He was just outside a few minutes ago, poking at ants with a twig, his small figure crouched near the fence line, where the dirt met the dry grass. Caleb was the kind of boy who noticed everything: the shapes of clouds, the flutter of moth wings, the faint scurrying of lizards beneath rocks. He loved the world with the pure, consuming wonder only a child could know. Claire turned off the stove and rinsed her hands at the sink. The wind picked up slightly, rattling a chime on the porch. She stepped out into the golden light, a kitchen towel still in one hand. The yard was empty, her brow furrowed. "Caleb," she called again, louder this time. Her voice carried into the open air and dissolved into silence. She walked briskly to the fence, eyes sweeping left and right. The low sun cast long shadows across the earth, making the desert look deeper, more endless. A sudden tightness gripped her chest. Normally, Caleb would answer by now with a giggle or a mischievous "I am hiding," but nothing. "Caleb!" she shouted. Her pace quickened. She scanned behind the chicken coop, checked under the porch, called into the open shed. She even peeked inside the large barrel where he once got stuck trying to chase a cat. Still nothing. Her heartbeat grew heavier with each step. When she circled back toward the gate, the realization struck like cold water. Her son was gone. Mark pulled into the driveway at that moment, his truck raising a small cloud of dust. Claire ran toward him, barefoot and breathless. "He's gone," she said, voice quivering. "Caleb's gone." Mark's expression shifted from confusion to sharp alertness in an instant. "What do you mean?" I looked away for just a minute, I swear, just 1 minute, and now his not anywhere. I've checked the whole yard. Twice! The fence was unlatched. They both turned toward the open stretch of desert beyond the property line, harsh, dry, and full of shadows now. As the sun sank even lower, Mark's throat tightened. At 5:20 p.m., he dialed the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. His hand shook as he gave the dispatcher his name, the boy's age, a description of his clothes, and the terrifying words no parent ever wants to speak. "Hez missing." Claire fell to her knees in the dirt near the gate, trembling hands clutched over her mouth. The wind was picking up, and with it came the creeping chill of dusk. The desert, for all its harshness, became another kind of dangerous when night fell. A silent place filled with predators, hidden drops, and no forgiveness for the lost. Within the hour, sheriff's deputies arrived, along with volunteers from the community. Word spread fast in small towns. Flashlights, ATVs, search dogs. A DPS helicopter flew overhead, cutting arcs across the fading sky, its searchlight sweeping the terrain like a beacon of desperate hope. Claire stood at the edge of the field, staring out into the darkness, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Every few minutes, she'd cry his name again, as if by sheer force of love he might appear from behind a bush or rock. But Caleb did not come. Somewhere out there, her baby boy was alone, wearing only a thin tank top and pajama pants, no shoes, no water, and no understanding of the dangers he faced. The sun dipped below the last ridge and night swallowed the desert whole. The stars had begun to prick the night sky above Seligman, glittering like cold embers over a land that was suddenly terrifyingly unfamiliar. The desert, so quiet and still during the day, now pulsed with a low, invisible hum, the kind that speaks of unseen creatures shifting shadows and secrets that live beneath the stones. It was no longer home. Not to Claire. Not without Caleb. She sat on the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, still wearing the same flour-dusted clothes from dinner prep. Her feet were blackened with dirt and dry grass. Her hair clung to her forehead in stiff curls of sweat and anxiety. She hadn't cried, yet not really. Not because she didn't want to, but because the fear had paralyzed everything except the basic function of hope. Somewhere her baby was out there, alive. He had to be. Behind her, the house felt unbearably quiet. His toys were still scattered across the living room, the stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear, the red plastic truck he insisted on taking to bed. A single sippy cup sat on the counter where she had left it. It still had a smear of apple juice on the rim. Claire had walked past it 20 times in the last 3 hours, but each time, the sight of it hit her like a punch to the chest. Outside, the search had become a moving constellation. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like fireflies, distant voices calling his name in a dozen directions. Every call echoed back unanswered. Caleb! Caleb Dunlap, little boy, come on now. You're safe, come to the light. It was nearly 9 p.m. The search grid had extended nearly 2 miles out in 3 directions. Dogs had picked up a faint trail near the back fence, but it had vanished among the rocks and hills. Deputy Vargas, the lead officer, approached the porch where Mark stood in stiff silence, watching the tree line with unblinking eyes. Claire had long since lost the energy to speak to anyone. She just sat rocking slightly, whispering prayers under her breath. "We've got more help coming from Prescott," Vargas said. "Helicopters with infrared more K-9S. We've marked off every ravine and cave for inspection. We're going to find him." Mark nodded, jaw clenched. How far could a 2-year-old walk? Vargas hesitated. A mile, maybe 2 under normal conditions. But in this terrain, he gestured toward the hills, jagged, unfamiliar ground with boulder outcroppings, narrow gullies, and blind slopes. It's tough going for adults. But sometimes, kids surprise us. They don't stop, they just keep moving. Mark's mouth went dry. That didn't sound comforting. That sounded like a warning. He looked back toward Claire, who hadn't moved except to raise her head slowly, almost as if she sensed what was being said. "His barefoot," she whispered. "He hates pebbles. He always tiptoes when the ground is too hot. He wouldn't go far." Head stop. Head cry. Someone would have heard him. Mark crouched beside her. "Well, find him." "Something's out there, Mark." Her voice broke slightly. "What if he's scared? What if he saw a coyote or a snake? What if he stopped her, gently taking her hand in his. "Don't do that. You can't go there. Hez out there waiting. Hez okay. We just need time." A low growl of an engine rumbled in the distance as another patrol truck pulled in. Neighbors from farther up the road had arrived with lanterns and night vision scopes. One of them brought a pair of ATVs. Another woman brought a casserole dish, completely unaware no one could eat. Everyone showed up with something: a flashlight, a shovel, a sense of desperation. One of the local ranchers, an older man named Scotty Dutton, stepped quietly up to the porch. His face was carved with sun lines, his hat stained from years of sweat and wind. "I brought Buford," he said softly. "He's not a search dog, but has got a nose like a hawk's eye. Sometimes better." Mark blinked. "Buford, my Anatolian Pyrenees. He's trained to keep coyotes off my livestock. Doesn't chase them, just stares them down. Has this calm about him. Kids love him, don't know what it is." Claire's head lifted sharply at the word kids. He's good with children, loves them, gentle as a shadow. Scotty gave her a nod. If Caleb's out there and Buford gets wind of him, he won't stop. That dog has the patience of a monk. Thank you, Mark, said emotion catching in his throat. The rancher nodded and disappeared into the dark, his flashlight bobbing as he led his dog toward the trailhead behind the property. Buford was huge, nearly the size of a small bear with thick white fur and eyes that seemed too human. He trotted beside his master with quiet purpose, ears perked, nose twitching. For the first time that night, Claire felt something flutter in her chest. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't despair either. Hope, fragile, trembling, but alive. She rose from the porch and stood beside her husband, both of them staring into the darkness where Buford had disappeared. The search was far from over, but now something had changed. Something out there had joined them, something loyal, silent, and determined to find the child the desert had swallowed. The desert didn't sleep. As the hours stretched deeper into the night, the Arizona wilderness revealed its other self, one not shown to tourists or daylight wanderers. It breathed in the silence, creaked with the movement of nocturnal creatures, and whispered with the voices of wind weaving through brush and stone. It was alive, but not friendly. And somewhere out there a toddler walked alone. The moon had risen high, its silver glow washing over the jagged terrain. Sagebrush cast sharp shadows. Rocks glimmered like bones under the lunar light. The temperature had dropped too, the dry heat of the day, replaced by a brisk chill that gnawed through the thin fabric of a child's pajama pants. Caleb Dunlap, only 2 years and 5 months old, walked with the slow, stumbling gait of a child too young to understand fear, but old enough to feel alone. His bare feet were scuffed and dusty, his hands scraped. Tears had dried on his cheeks hours ago. The adrenaline from his initial wander had worn off, leaving confusion and exhaustion. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew one thing: keep walking. He hadn't meant to run away. The gate had been open. The chickens were clucking. He remembered chasing one with a yellow feather. He remembered the sun being big and low and warm. Then, everything was different. Now his legs trembled with every step. He paused at the base of a hill where the rocks piled into a natural staircase. The moonlight glimmered at the top. Behind him, coyotes yipped far in the distance, one voice answered by another, then another. Caleb turned toward the sound, but didn't flinch. He didn't know enough to be afraid. Instead, he sat, tucked himself under the crook of a twisted mesquite tree, curled into a ball like he did when he slept in bed, one hand tucked under his cheek. His small chest rose and fell slowly. The desert sang its lullaby wind, chirping insects, and the creaking of branches in the cold. And then quietly another figure entered the wilderness. Buford had picked up a scent. The Anatolian Pyrenees moved with purpose, nose low to the ground, tail flicking gently behind him. He wasn't barking, wasn't rushing. His style was patience instinct. He had guarded livestock from predators for years. This was no different, only now it was a baby he hunted to protect. Behind him, his owner Scotty followed with a quiet gate flashlight flicking side to side. "It's got something," Scotty muttered into his radio. "Buford's on a trail. Heading northeast ridge past Dry Hollow." Deputy Vargas' voice crackled back. "Copy that. Sending units to parallel you." Scotty turned off the radio. He knew the sound could spook wildlife or a frightened child. Buford continued forward, pausing every few feet to lift his head, sniff the air, then press onward again. After nearly 30 minutes, the terrain grew more complicated. Boulder piles appeared like giant sleeping beasts. The ridgeline narrowed. To any adult, it would have been a dangerous climb. To a toddler, it was a miracle of passage. Scotty stopped, knelt beside a patch of earth. There, pressed into the dust, was a faint crescent print. Tiny toes heel another step farther on. He swallowed hard. "Oh Lord," he whispered, heart thudding. He made it this far. Buford let out a short, low chuff. Then he turned east. 20 more minutes passed before the dog stopped, completely standing like a statue, near a thicket of trees. Scotty lifted his light, nothing at first. Then, movement. A small figure stirred beneath a branch. Scotty's breath caught. "Caleb," he called softly. The figure didn't answer. Buford stepped forward carefully, not making a sound. He sniffed, leaned down, and licked the boy's face gently. The child stirred, groggy, blinking. His eyes fluttered open. "Doggy," he mumbled. Scotty stepped forward now, his voice breaking. "Caleb, it's okay. You're safe now. We're going to take you home." The boy blinked again. "I was cold," he said simply. Then Doggy came. Buford lay beside him, big body curled protectively around the child's small frame. Caleb instinctively nestled into the fur like a puppy finding its mother. Scotty radioed in. "I've got him, alive, cold but talking. Location is South Ridge near Devil's Notch. Repeat, child is safe." Cheers echoed over the channel. More units mobilized instantly. The helicopter above changed course. Within 20 minutes, EMTs reached the scene. They wrapped Caleb in a blanket, checked his vitals. His feet were scratched, but not deeply cut. His hands had dirt in the nails. He was mildly dehydrated, but lucid. But he was smiling now. He kept one hand buried in Buford's fur, even when they tried to gently lift him. "Doggy stays," he said firmly, eyes wide and certain. Scotty nodded. "Don't worry, son. He ain't going anywhere." Back at the Dunlap home, Claire had fallen asleep on the porch cheek, resting against Mark's shoulder. They had both dozed off, out of sheer exhaustion, candles flickering in a circle around them. Then a voice came over the radio. "Vargas. Target found. Alive and safe." Returning home with the boy now. Claire bolted upright, gasping. "What?" Mark replayed the message louder this time. Claire's scream rang through the night. "Caleb! Oh my God, Caleb!" She ran barefoot into the yard, crying, laughing, shaking all at once. Mark followed dazed as vehicles approached from down the dirt path. The first light to pull up wasn't red or blue, but a rancher's truck, and there, seated proudly in the front seat with a child in his arms, was Scotty. Buford rode in the back, tongue out, tail wagging like a flag in the breeze. Claire didn't wait. She rushed forward as Scotty carefully handed the boy down into her arms. "Mama," Caleb said sleepily. She dropped to her knees, clutching him against her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Mark fell beside her, wrapping them both in his arms. They stayed like that for minutes, unable to let go, as the neighbors, deputies, and stranger-stern searchers gathered to witness a miracle. And standing quietly among them, watching it all, Buford sat with calm eyes and ears turned forward. He didn't bark, he didn't move. He just watched the family reunite. Later, when the news crews came and the sheriff's office released statements and everyone wanted to name the boy the miracle toddler, Scotty would simply say, "Buford found him." That's the story. The first rays of morning sun broke over the rugged Arizona horizon, spilling amber light across the dusty town of Seligman. The light stretched slowly, climbing over cattle fences, creeping through slatted barn doors, and finally warming the windows of the small Dunlap farmhouse where an extraordinary miracle had occurred just hours before. Inside, everything was still. Claire Dunlap sat beside her son's bed, one hand resting lightly on his back as he slept, the other gripping a half-finished mug of tea. Her eyes were redrimmed from a night of terror, followed by a wave of exhausted relief. She hadn't left his side since they brought him home, not even to sleep. Caleb lay peacefully beneath a quilt, handmade by Claire's grandmother. A bandage wrapped one of his little feet, and there was still desert dust smudged across his cheek. But his breathing was steady and deep. Every few minutes he made a small sound in his throat, a dream murmur or a sigh of comfort, and each time Claire's heart swelled with gratitude. Mark stood just outside the room, speaking in a hushed tone to Sheriff Clay Forrester, who'd stopped by for a welfare check and a cup of coffee. The sheriff removed his hat respectfully and nodded toward the doorway. "Has a tough one," Clay said softly. "Hell of a spirit for a 2-year-old. Mark smiled faintly. "Gets it from his mother." Clay let the compliment stand. "I just wanted to lay eyes on him myself," the sheriff added. "We've had rescues before. Lost hikers, injured ranch hands, even a drunk who tried to walk the flagstaff. But never a toddler in mountain lion territory." Mark's gaze darkened. "I still don't know how he made it so far. 7 miles. It doesn't feel possible. That's what everyone's saying. But he did. And that dog Buford, Lord Almighty, that dog might love, saved his life." As if summoned, Buford padded quietly down the hallway, his huge paws soft on the wood floor. He peeked into Caleb's room, then circled once on the rug just outside the door, lying down with a soft groan. Claire looked over and gave him a tired smile. "I've never seen anything like it," she whispered. He hasn't left Caleb's side. The dog rested his chin on his paws and closed his eyes, content to stay there for as long as needed. By 9 a.m., word had spread throughout Seligman not just of Caleb's rescue but of the dog that found him. Locals began arriving with casseroles, coffee, and tears. Some came to bring gifts, others just to stand at the end of the driveway and offer quiet thanks. For a town of less than 500 people, Seligman had always been tight-knit, but this event had stirred something deeper, a shared sense of awe and humility. Scotty Dutton, still wearing his worn rancher's boots and his sun-bleached cap, parked his truck outside and was greeted like a returning hero. "Damn fine work, Scotty. You and that dog, you're legends now." He tipped his hat awkwardly, never one for attention. Buford's the one, deserves the praise. Inside, Claire finally stepped out to greet the crowd. She carried Caleb in her arms, swaddled in a blanket. The sight of him, safe, smiling cheeks, rosy again, sparked applause, gasps, and even a few sobs. Mrs. Redmond, from the corner grocery, pushed forward with a basket of fresh fruit. "He likes bananas, doesn't he? I remember you bought a bunch last week." Claire nodded, overcome by the love pouring from all sides. Caleb lifted his hand and pointed at Buford, who had followed quietly behind her. "Doggy saved me," he said simply. At the sheriff's office, later that day, the rescue report was finalized. Subject: Caleb Dunlap, age 2, location found. 6.9 miles northeast of residence time, missing, approximately 16 hours conditions. Cold night, uneven terrain, known predator presence, dog involved. Buford Anatolian Pyrenees, integral to child's discovery and safety. The news media had already gotten hold of the story. Local networks from Flagstaff and Phoenix were broadcasting headlines like "Desert Miracle," "Toddler found alive after night in wilderness guardian dog," "Leads rancher to missing boy Arizona's hero," "Buford the Brave." By evening, the story had gone national. Reporters flooded the sheriff's office with requests for interviews, footage, and comment. One network even sent a helicopter to film aerial shots of the rescue site. Sheriff Clay took it in stride, but he made one thing clear. That dog isn't going to Hollywood. He stays here with his family, with the land. When asked what he thought made Buford follow the boy, he answered, "Some things you don't question. A dog knows what's right better than most men." Back on the ranch, Scotty watched the setting sun, with Buford lying beside him on the porch. "I knew you were special when I picked you out of that litter," he murmured, running a hand along the dog's thick fur. "Didn't know you'd turn out to be a guardian angel." Buford's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, watching as dusk once again crept over the land. This time, though, there was peace. Down in the Dunlap house, Caleb was back in his bed, a small stuffed animal tucked beside him, a gift from one of the neighbors. Claire sat reading to him, her voice soft and soothing, while Mark leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, grateful beyond words. Outside, Seligman returned to its rhythm. But something had changed. A bond had been forged, not just between a boy and a dog, or a family and a rancher, but between every soul who had feared, hoped, and prayed through the longest night of their lives. And in the center of it all stood Buford, calm, loyal, and brave. The sun was well above the horizon, now casting sharp desert light across the red dirt roads of Yavapai County. But inside the small, whitewashed house where the Dunlaps lived, shadows still clung to corners and behind curtains, as if the fear from the previous night hadn't quite loosened its grip. Caleb was safe. Yes, sleeping soundly and surrounded by warmth, but the questions had begun to pile up like clouds before a monsoon storm. Sheriff Clay Forrester leaned against the farmhouse kitchen counter hat, in one hand notepad in the other. Had interviewed dozens of people in his 30 years of law enforcement, drunk ranch, hands rowdy teenagers, worried parents, but this was different. He wasn't here to investigate a crime, not exactly. He was here because something impossible had happened, and someone had to understand it. Claire poured him another cup of coffee, her fingers trembling slightly as she set the pot down. "Sheriff," she said softly, "how do you want to do this?" Clay gave a tired half-smile. "Just want to get the timeline straight. What you remember. What you saw. Doesn't have to be perfect." Mark took a seat across from him, rubbing his hands together. We had just finished dinner around 4:30. Claire went to put the dishes away. I was in the garage. Caleb was in the living room with his crayons. We weren't more than 15 feet from him. And then the sheriff prompted gently. "He was just gone." Claire said, her voice cracking. 1 second he was coloring on that little fold-out table. Next time I looked up, he wasn't there. They'd searched the house, the yard, the barn. Mark had sprinted through the pastures, calling his son's name, until his voice gave out. Claire had called 911, sobbing so hard the dispatcher couldn't understand her at first. Within 40 minutes, the Yavapai County Search and Rescue Team had mobilized. Flashlights cut through sagebrush. Radios crackled into the dark. But Caleb was nowhere to be found. Sheriff Clay made a note. He wandered out the back gate. Mark said, shame in his voice. It doesn't latch properly, unless you really press it shut. I fixed it last month, but I guess it came loose again. Clay nodded. Kids get curious. Gates swing open. Claire stared down into her lap. But how did he make it so far? Sheriff. 7 miles through that terrain. Barefoot. I don't know, Clay admitted. That's what we're all trying to understand. At the sheriff's department, Deputy Lisa Rayburn sat at her desk, eyes locked on a map of the region. She had drawn Caleb's presumed path with a red marker, highlighting the contours of the land arroyos, dry creek beds, cactus fields, and ridges. The land was harsh, unforgiving. Rattlesnakes, coyotes, mountain lions. Even experienced hikers got turned around out there. She glanced over at her computer screen where drone footage from the DPS helicopter flickered. There she whispered to herself, pausing the footage. That's him. A blurry shape, a tiny figure in blue, moved between juniper trees. And behind him, unmistakably, was Buford. The dog never let the boy out of his sight. In fact, the video showed Buford walking ahead, turning back every few feet, guiding the boy like a shepherd with a lamb. Lisa sat back in awe. She opened a new file, Buford, Rescue Dog Report, and typed, Buford appears to have located the child sometime during the early morning hours and remained with him until they reached the Dunton property. Drone footage indicates he actively guided the child and provided physical protection in an area known for predator activity. She paused. What made a livestock guardian dog trained to protect sheep from predators suddenly decide that a human toddler was his responsibility? Instinct, empathy. Something else. She leaned forward again and typed, motivation. Unknown. Behavior suggests intelligence beyond typical working patterns. Meanwhile, Buford lay outside the farmhouse, stretched out in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Scotty Dunton sat beside him, legs crossed, sipping from a chipped metal cup of cowboy coffee. A pair of journalists from a Flagstaff news station stood nearby, fumbling with microphones and cameras. Can we ask you a few questions? One of them said, a young woman with nervous energy. We're doing a piece called Desert Angel, the dog that saved Caleb. Scotty shrugged. Talk if you want. But Buford won't. They chuckled, hoping for more, but Scotty wasn't a man of many words. He scratched Buford's ear gently. You'll tell you this, he finally said. He was acting strange that morning. Just took off along the ridge. Didn't even wait for his breakfast. Had he ever done that before, the other reporter asked. Scotty shook his head. Nope, not once. He patrols the same circuit every morning. South fence, then west slope back to the barn. It's in his bones. That's how these dogs are. Predictable. Steady. This was different. The journalist scribbled furiously. I think he heard something. Scotty continued staring out at the hills. Or smelled something. Fear, maybe. That boy was afraid. Lost, Buford knew. Back at the Dunlap home, Caleb was awake and sitting on the porch, a sippy cup in one hand and a teddy bear in the other. He wore a pair of 2 big cowboy boots, a neighbor's gift, and Buford lay beside him, head resting near the boy's knees. Claire sat with them, watching her son with wide, grateful eyes. She hadn't asked him much about what happened. Not yet. The trauma was too fresh. But Caleb was starting to talk slowly in small fragments. Tree fell, he said suddenly, pointing to the west. Claire leaned forward. A tree fell. He nodded. Scared me. Then I saw Big Doggy. Buford thumped his tail once. And then she asked, Caleb furrowed his brow. Doggy walked. I followed. We looked for Daddy. I was sleepy. We found a barn. I saw Bird. Claire swallowed hard. His words came in broken pieces, but they painted a vivid picture. A child frightened alone, finding comfort in a creature so big he could ride it like a pony, trusting that the dog would lead him home. Doggy stayed with me, Caleb said. Didn't let me cry. Claire's eyes welled with tears. The questions would continue from neighbors, from law enforcement, from journalists and psychologists. How did Caleb survive? Why did Buford help? Could it happen again? But Claire didn't need the answers right now. She reached over and placed her hand on the dog's thick fur. Thank you, she whispered. Buford blinked once, then leaned into her touch. Some questions don't need answers. Some are better left as mysteries, wrapped in dust and sunshine, carried across the desert by paws and prayers. The small town of Seligman, Arizona had a way of keeping to itself. Tucked away between mountains, surrounded by vast stretches of rugged land, it was a place where the world often passed by unnoticed. The main street was lined with antique shops, diners, serving fresh pies, and weather-beaten motels. A handful of local families lived in the area, most of them ranchers, farmers, or retirees. Life was simple. The air dry, and time often seemed to stretch lazily over the landscape, just as it had for generations. But that had all changed overnight. When the news broke about the missing child, it spread like wildfire. People who hadn't seen each other in years found themselves standing at the local gas station, discussing the latest search efforts, comparing notes and swapping theories. The town that usually kept its distance from the outside world was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Within hours, TV news vans from Flagstaff, Phoenix, and even Las Vegas had pulled into the dirt parking lot of the Seligman Market. They set up their cameras, their satellite dishes, and began to interview the townsfolk. The search operation continued around the clock, but it was clear that the heart of the story now rested on a single question. How had a 2-year-old boy managed to survive for 16 hours alone in the Arizona wilderness with nothing but his wits and a dog to guide him? Scotty Dutton, for his part, had wanted no part of the media frenzy. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He preferred the company of his cattle, the quiet hum of life on his ranch. But when his dog Buford became the subject of every headline, he couldn't escape the limelight. A local news crew caught up with him just as he finished breakfast. Scotty had been sitting on the porch, chewing on a piece of bacon while Buford lay next to him, his massive form sprawled out on the wooden steps. The camera crew stood at a distance, clearly trying to figure out how to approach the man who had become an unwitting hero. "You've heard what they're saying about Buford, right?" the reporter asked, holding a microphone toward him. Scotty nodded, taking a slow sip of coffee. "Yeah, I've heard. And what do you think? They're calling him a hero." Scotty didn't flinch. "Buford's just doing his job. Has a good dog." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "Just doing his job. You don't think that's a bit modest?" Scotty shrugged. "I don't know about all that hero stuff. Has a livestock guardian dog. Protects the herd. Keeps coyotes and mountain lions away. If he found Caleb its cause, the boy needed him. But he could have stayed with his herd. He didn't have to go after a lost child." "No," Scotty said, "he didn't. But that's the kind of dog he is. He's always been protective, even with the kids around here." The reporter didn't know how to respond. She glanced at Buford, who was now yawning lazily on the steps. The dog's massive size and calm demeanor made him seem like an unlikely hero, but the more they talked to those who knew him, the clearer it became that Buford's actions had been driven by something deeper than instinct. He wasn't just protecting the boy. He was guiding him, walking with him through the night, never leaving his side. Across town, the sheriff's office continued to sift through evidence, interviewing locals who might have seen something unusual the night Caleb went missing. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, and no clue as to how the child had made it so far so quickly. Every search team that had gone out had returned empty-handed until the miraculous moment when Scotty had found them. "Sheriff, you've got to explain it," one of the deputies, Lisa Rayburn, asked as they reviewed the helicopter footage of Buford walking alongside Caleb. How did the dog know Clay Forrester looked over the footage once again? The drone footage was unclear at times, but it was evident that Buford wasn't just walking with Caleb. He was actively guiding him. The two figures had been moving in tandem like they had a purpose, and there was something unspoken between them. "I don't know," Clay said slowly, his voice laced with doubt, "but I've been in this business long enough to know that sometimes there are things we can't explain." "I've never seen a dog like this," Lisa said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Hez not just protecting the boy, it's like Kez keeping him on course." "And we still don't know how the kid made it 7 miles, Clay added. "That's not a short walk, especially not through the kind of rough terrain we have around here." Lisa nodded. "Yeah, not to mention the predators. Lions, coyotes, and the occasional bear. It's a miracle nothing found him." It was clear to both of them that the rescue of Caleb had defied all logic. There was no explanation for the dog's actions other than pure instinct or something more. Why, blank, underscore, blank, as the day wore on the town buzzed with activity. Locals visited the Dunlap home, bringing casseroles and fresh-baked bread to help ease the family's stress. But even in their relief, there was an undeniable sense of wonder about what had happened. It wasn't every day that a toddler went missing, only to be found 7 miles away guided, there by dog. The school, which had been closed the day Caleb had gone missing, was now flooded with visitors. Some wanted to see the boy, others to witness the dog that had walked through the wilderness with him. Even the local kids who had once found the Dunlaps' quiet life odd had gathered outside their home whispering excitedly about the dog and the boy. "We're calling him the Desert Hero," one little girl said, as she ran past the Dunlap property, her friends trailing behind her. The name stuck, and soon it was all anyone in town could talk about. Claire sat quietly on the porch, watching the hustle and bustle around her. Caleb was inside taking a nap, and Mark had gone out to check the fence. Her mind, though, was racing with thoughts. Why had Buford gone after Caleb? What had been his motive? It seemed impossible for the dog to have known what was happening, yet there was no other explanation for his actions. "Thank you," she whispered softly, looking at Buford, who was lying beside her once more, resting his head on her feet. The world outside was changing, but inside it felt like time had paused, held in place by the quiet bond between a child and his dog, one that was unspoken but understood. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch, yet a sense of unease lingered in the air. Despite Caleb's miraculous return, something still felt unsettled to everyone in town. The rescue of the boy had been nothing short of miraculous, but there was an underlying question that kept creeping into the minds of the townsfolk. What exactly had happened out there in the wilderness? Why had Caleb wandered so far from home in the first place, and how had he survived the night alone? For the authorities, the most pressing concern was understanding the boy's journey. How had he made it 7 miles, especially through the harsh terrain of the Arizona wilderness? And perhaps most disturbingly, why had he been left alone to begin with? Were there clues that had been missed? Had the family failed to notice something before it was too late? Sheriff Clay Forrester couldn't stop replaying the events in his head. He'd been involved in enough search and rescue operations to know that most cases had a predictable pattern, but this one was different. It didn't make sense. The more he thought about it, the less he understood. Why had the boy wandered off so far in the middle of nowhere? Why hadn't anyone heard him cry out? And what role had Buford played in all of this? The dog had clearly been the key to Caleb's survival, guiding him through the night. But how had he known to do that? Clay's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his office door opening. Lisa Rayburn, the deputy who had been assisting with the search, stepped inside, her face serious. "Sheriff, we found something," she said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. Clay took it from her, his brow furrowing as he looked at the paper. It was a map of the ranch with markings all over it. Some of them were obvious trails, landmarks, and the general layout of the land, but one particular marking caught his attention. It was located in a remote corner of the ranch, far from any of the usual patrol routes. "This doesn't make any sense," Clay muttered. "What's this about?" Lisa leaned over his shoulder, her finger tracing the strange marking. "It's near the old barn." "But there's nothing there, just some overgrown land and rocks." Clay felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard rumors about the old barn. Some of the locals swore it was haunted. Others said it had once been a hideout for drug runners. No one knew for sure, and over the years it had fallen into disuse. But now, seeing the map and its connection to the boy's disappearance, it was hard to ignore the possibility that the barn might hold some answers. "Do you think Caleb wandered out there?" Clay asked, his voice low. Lisa shook her head. I don't know, but it's a lead, and it's worth checking out. The sheriff stood up, looking out the window of his office toward the distant horizon. He could see the mountains rising sharply against the sky, the rugged landscape stretching for miles. The idea that a 2-year-old could have made it across that terrain was almost impossible to believe. Yet somehow Caleb had managed it. And now the more Clay thought about it, the more questions arose. What had happened in those missing hours? At the same time, back at the Dutton Ranch, life had somewhat returned to normal. The family had gathered in the kitchen, taking comfort in the fact that Caleb was safe. The boy had been examined by doctors and given a clean bill of health, physically at least. But emotionally, he was a different story. Caleb had spent the night in his parents' bed, holding onto them tightly, his small frame trembling with anxiety. His mother Claire had tried to coax him into talking, but he hadn't said much. The only words that came out were fragmented phrases, dog tree and night. Do you remember what happened, Caleb? She had asked, gently brushing his hair away from his forehead. The boy had simply clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder. Buford, he had whispered. Buford stayed with me. Claire had tried to smile, but there was a tinge of sadness in her eyes. She couldn't help but wonder what had gone through Caleb's mind during those long, lonely hours in the wilderness. What had he seen? What had he felt? And why had he gone so far from home in the first place? She glanced at her husband Mark, who was sitting at the kitchen table looking out the window. He hadn't said much since the rescue. His face was grim, lost in thought. Claire knew he was troubled, but she didn't know how to help him. Like everyone else, he had questions that no one had answers to. Mark looked over at her, his gaze softening. Hez. Alive. That's all that matters. Claire nodded, though. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her chest. She wanted to believe it was that simple, that their son was safe, and that life would return to normal. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I know, she whispered. But I can't stop thinking about what happened. How did he get out there? And why Mark didn't answer, his expression clouded with his own thoughts. The quiet between them stretched on, as if neither one of them knew how to fill the silence. Outside, Buford was resting under a tree, his large frame still and calm. He had stayed close to the family ever since Caleb's return, and while the boy's safety had brought them all comfort, the dog's role in the ordeal remained a mystery. What had prompted Buford to leave the herd and track down Caleb? How had he known where the boy was, and why had he stayed with him for so long? In the days that followed, the Duttons tried to return to their routine, but the questions lingered unanswered. The townsfolk continued to speculate about what had happened, but no one had the full story. No one could explain the miracle that had unfolded in the wilderness. Sheriff Forrester's office began to investigate the mysterious markings on the map, planning an expedition to the old barn. They knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. And with every passing day, the pressure to find answers grew. The investigation into Caleb's disappearance had taken on a new urgency. With each passing day, the questions surrounding the boy's miraculous survival and the role of the ranch dog Buford seemed to grow deeper. Sheriff Forrester, along with his team, knew they had to dig further if they were to uncover the truth of what had transpired in the vast wilderness of Arizona. It was a cool morning when the search party set out for the old barn. Sheriff Forrester stood by his truck, scanning the horizon where the rugged mountains met the endless stretch of desert. The land here was unforgiving, with dry ravines, thorny brush, and steep cliffs. It was easy to see why the locals spoke of the old barn as a place that was avoided by most. This is the spot, Clay said to Deputy Lisa Rayburn, who stood beside him studying the map. We'll start here. Lisa nodded, glancing at the team of rangers and search volunteers behind them. They were all experienced, but the terrain posed a significant challenge. The idea of a 2-year-old boy making it through this unforgiving land was almost impossible to fathom. And yet Caleb had managed it somehow. As they made their way deeper into the wilderness, the air grew hotter. The sound of their boots crunching on the dry ground seemed to echo through the stillness. Clay couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though it was probably just the nerves and uncertainty of the case. Still, the eerie silence that hung over the land was unsettling. After several hours of navigating the rugged terrain, they finally arrived at the site of the old barn. It was a dilapidated structure, its once proud timbers now weathered and worn. The walls were covered in vines and the roof had caved in several places. Despite its run-down state, there was something undeniably ominous about the place. The hairs on the back of Clay's neck stood on end as he surveyed the area. "I don't like this place," Lisa remarked, her voice hushed. "We're here now?" Clay replied, his tone steely. "Let's see what we can find." The team split up to search the perimeter, carefully inspecting every inch of the barn and the surrounding area. Clay moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. He noticed the uneven tracks in the dirt. They looked like human footprints, but they were faint and scattered. The tracks led toward the barn, but it was hard to tell how recent they were. A sudden rustling in the bushes made everyone freeze. Clay's hand instinctively reached for his gun. But before he could react, Buford appeared from the shadows, his large frame moving silently through the underbrush. The dog was calm, as always, and stood at the edge of the group, watching them with intelligent eyes. Buford Clay murmured, feeling a sense of relief. The dog had become a local legend, and his presence seemed to bring some comfort to the team. Buford walked over to Clay, sitting at his feet, as if to say that everything was okay. The sheriff crouched down, petting the dog's thick coat. "You always seem to know where the trouble is," he said with a grin. Lisa stepped forward, a frown on her face. "Sheriff, look over here," she called. Clay followed her to the barn's entrance, where Lisa had found something strange in the dirt. A set of fresh tracks, small childlike footprints, led directly to the barn. Clay's heart skipped a beat. The footprints were unmistakable. They were Caleb's. "This doesn't make sense," Clay muttered, crouching down to examine the tracks. "These prints are from the boy. But how could he have come here alone?" Lisa looked at him, her brow furrowing. "You think someone else brought him here?" Clay stood up, his mind racing. "I don't know. But these tracks tell me one thing: Caleb was here. And if Buford led him here, then there's more to this story than we're being told." The team continued to search the area, uncovering more evidence that seemed to confirm their suspicions. A small blanket had been found near the barn, tucked carefully underneath a pile of rocks. It was a simple faded piece of fabric, but it had Caleb's scent on it. Clay could feel the unease creeping back in. As the day wore on, they found more signs that Caleb had indeed made his way through this remote corner of the ranch. The small, desperate trail of footprints, the blanket, and the dog's presence all pointed to one undeniable fact. The boy had been here. But why? What had drawn him to this place? The mystery only deepened as the search team began to make their way back to the ranch. With each step, Clay's frustration grew. He felt like they were on the cusp of discovering something important, but the answers remained elusive. Every lead seemed to raise more questions. How had Caleb ended up so far from home? What had happened in the hours that he was missing? And, most importantly, why had he been drawn to the barn? As they made their way back to the ranch, Clay couldn't help but think of Caleb's words. "Buford stayed with me." The dog had remained by his side for nearly the entire journey, yet there was still so much they didn't understand. Had Buford been following some sort of instinct? Or was there something else at play here? Something that no one had anticipated? At the ranch, the Duntons had returned to their usual routine, trying to carry on with their lives, though the emotional toll of the ordeal was evident in their eyes. Claire and Mark sat at the kitchen table, talking softly to one another as Caleb played nearby, still clutching onto his stuffed animal tightly. "Has not the same as he." Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mark shook his head. "No, as not." They both watched as Caleb looked up at them, his bright blue eyes distant and filled with fear. The boy had been through something that neither of them fully understood. But as much as they longed for answers, they knew that the truth would come in its own time. Meanwhile, Buford rested outside the house, watching the horizon. The ranch dog had done his job, and it was clear to everyone that without him, Caleb might not have made it back. But the question remained, had Buford just been doing what he was bred to do, or had there been something more, something beyond the realm of human understanding? The days following Caleb's miraculous return to the ranch were filled with more questions than answers. Sheriff Clay Forrester spent his days sifting through the evidence, trying to piece together the puzzle of how the toddler had survived his perilous journey through the wilderness. Yet the more he investigated, the more tangled the story seemed to become. The ranch dog Buford had been the key to Caleb's safe return, but there was something unsettling about the way the dog had appeared at just the right moment. Clay had spent hours reviewing the reports, retracing Caleb's steps and following the faint traces the boy had left in the wilderness. But nothing about the way the dog had stayed by Caleb's side made sense. It wasn't just loyalty. It was as if Buford knew exactly where to guide the boy. The sheriff leaned against the porch railing, staring out over the vast Arizona desert. The sun was setting, casting an orange hue over the land, and the wind carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. There was a quiet that had settled over the ranch, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that comes when something isn't quite right, when you're close to the truth but just out of reach. Sheriff Forrester had decided to return to the barn that morning. He knew there was something there, something he had missed on his first visit. The footprints, the blanket, and the strange sense of foreboding that had lingered in the air. It all pointed to something greater. But what? As the sheriff arrived at the old barn, the place looked even more menacing in the early morning light. The walls were covered in thick vines that twisted around the wooden beams, their green tendrils reaching out like the fingers of a long-dead creature. The air was thick with the scent of must and decay, and the faint sound of rustling came from the tall grass at the edge of the barn. Clay's boots crunched on the dirt as he approached the entrance, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. He wasn't sure why he was so tense, but something about the barn unsettled him. It had always been a place of mystery, but now, it seemed like something far darker was hiding there. His eyes scanned the ground, noting the faint impressions in the earth where Caleb had walked. It was obvious the child had been here, but there was something strange about how the footprints seemed to disappear near the barn's foundation, almost as if they had been wiped away. It was as though someone had deliberately erased any trace of the boy's presence. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the shadows of the barn, sending a chill down Clay's spine. He froze his hand instinctively, reaching for his gun. Then, stepping out of the darkness, Buford appeared. The Anatolian Pyrenees walked slowly toward Clay, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. There was something in those eyes, something that made the hairs on Clay's neck stand on end. The dog was calm, but there was an intelligence in his gaze that was unsettling. Buford had always been protective, but now Clay felt an unfamiliar weight to the dog's presence. "Buford Clay," murmured his voice low. "What is it, boy?" The dog gave a low whine, his tail wagging only slightly. He walked up to Clay and nudged the sheriff's hand gently, then turned to lead him further into the barn. Clay hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to be cautious, but there was something about Buford's behavior that drew him forward. As they entered the barn, the air grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, engulfing the room in an eerie stillness. Clay's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he could make out the remnants of what had once been a storage area. Old hay bales were scattered around, and broken crates lay in disarray. There was a faint smell of mildew in the air, but what caught Clay's attention was the faint outline of something hidden in the corner of the barn. Buford walked over to the spot, his tail still low. He stopped in front of a stack of old boxes and stood motionless, staring at the ground. Clay approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. What had Buford found? He reached down and pulled away the boxes, revealing a small weathered journal. The leather cover was cracked and faded, and the pages inside looked yellowed with age. Clay's fingers trembled as he opened the journal, his eyes scanning the first few lines. The handwriting was faint, but legible. July 12th, 1922. The ranch was never the same after the storm. Buford came to me in the night, and I knew then that I could trust him. He would be my protector, and no harm would come to my family with him around. The words sent a chill down Clay's spine. The journal seemed to date back decades long before the Duntons had taken ownership of the ranch. The mention of Buford's name was even more bizarre had the dog's lineage been passed down through generations. He flipped through the pages, each entry more unsettling than the last. The journal chronicled strange events at the ranch, some of which seemed too unbelievable to be true. There were stories of disappearances of people who had wandered off and were never found, and of animals behaving in ways that defied explanation. But what stood out most was the mention of Buford, the ranch dog, who had apparently played a role in protecting the ranch for generations. As Clay reached the last few pages, his heart skipped a beat. One final entry stood out, written in a hurried hand. "They've returned. The curse is upon us once more. Buford knows what must be done. He will protect the boy at all costs." The sheriff's mind raced as he closed the journal, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The journal wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a message, a warning, and it seemed to suggest that Buford wasn't just a dog. He was something much more, something deeply tied to the land and its dark secrets. Clay took a deep breath, his mind spinning with the implications. The mystery of Caleb's survival was only the beginning. There was something far older and far more sinister at play here. And Buford, the seemingly ordinary ranch dog, was at the center of it all. Sheriff Clay Forrester could not shake the feeling that the ranch, the boy, and Buford were all part of something much larger than a simple missing persons case. His mind raced through the journal's pages, each word revealing more questions than answers. He had known for years that the land had an unsettling quality about it, a kind of weight that lingered in the air. But now, after seeing the journal and Buford's mysterious behavior, Clay wondered if there was something darker at work here, something that had been woven into the fabric of this place for generations. The sun hung low in the sky as Clay left the barn and returned to his truck. The journal was tucked carefully under his arm, but it felt heavier than before, as though the weight of its contents was pressing against him. He couldn't ignore the chilling thought that kept creeping into his mind. Buford wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian bound to the land in a way that defied reason. And if the journal was to be believed, Buford's lineage had been serving as this land's protector for over a century. The sheriff drove back toward the Dunton ranch house, his thoughts swirling in the quiet of the truck. He needed to talk to Scotty Dunton, the rancher who had found Caleb and whose dog had played a pivotal role in the boy's survival. Clay had to understand more about Buford and what the dog's presence meant to the ranch, to the family, and to Caleb. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, Clay noticed Buford again, this time lying calmly beneath a large mesquite tree near the porch. The dog's presence was almost otherworldly, like a sentinel, keeping watch over the land. The ranch house loomed in the background, its silhouette sharp against the evening sky. Scotty was waiting on the porch, a tall man with a rugged appearance, his hands weathered from years of working the land. The rancher had a calm demeanor, but Clay could tell that something was weighing on him too. Maybe it was the thought of Caleb being so close to danger, or the strange happenings that seemed to follow the boy's disappearance. Whatever it was, Clay knew they needed to talk. Sheriff Scotty greeted him, stepping down from the porch and meeting Clay halfway. His voice was low, almost as if he was trying not to disturb the air around them. Scotty, Clay replied, shaking his hand. "Mind if we talk for a minute? There's something I need to ask you." Scotty nodded, his eyes flicking toward Buford, who was watching them intently. "Sure. Come on inside." The two men walked into the house, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The smell of coffee hung in the air, and Clay could see the remnants of a late meal on the table, a reminder that life had to go on even after the chaos of the past 24 hours. They sat at the table, the conversation turning quickly to the events surrounding Caleb's disappearance. But soon Clay steered the discussion toward the journal, the one he had found in the barn. "I found something today," Clay began, his voice measured. "Something strange. It's a journal belonged to someone who lived on this land a long time ago. It mentions Buford. It talks about how the dog has been guarding this ranch for generations." Scotty's eyes narrowed as he listened. "Buford guarding the ranch." "That's what it says," Clay replied. "The journal mentions a curse, something that ties Buford to this land, to the boy, and to something darker. The more I think about it, the more I realize that this isn't just a regular dog. He's not just protecting the ranch, he's protecting something far more significant." Scotty leaned forward, his face clouded with concern. "Are you telling me this dog? He's something special." "That's hard to believe, Sheriff." Clay met Scotty's gaze, his mind working over the words he had just spoken. It felt strange even saying it aloud. But something about Buford's presence, his role in Caleb's survival, and the journal's words made it impossible to ignore. "I don't know what to believe, but there's something going on here. Something that ties Buford to the land. The journal said something about a curse, about Buford protecting the boy, but I don't know what that means yet." Scotty was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I've heard stories from folks who used to live here. Strange things happened. People disappeared. Animals acting wrong. But I never thought much about it. It was just old talk. But after what happened to Caleb, I don't know anymore. Tell me more about Buford," Clay said, leaning forward. "How long has he been with the family?" Scotty hesitated, his eyes flickering to the window, where Buford still lay outside. "Buford came to us about 5 years ago. We were having problems with coyotes getting too close to the herd. I'd heard about this dog from some folks down south. Anatolian Pyrenees, a breed known for guarding livestock. He was the last of a line of dogs. His old owner couldn't keep him anymore, so he took him in. Clay's curiosity piqued. And you never had any issues with him? No strange behavior? Not at all, Scotty replied. He's always been calm, steady, a great dog. He'd patrol the property, keep the coyotes away, and never get into trouble. But lately has been different. A little more distant, almost like has got something on his mind. But has still been looking after Caleb. Clay frowned. You think he knew something was coming? Scotty sighed. I don't know what to think anymore. But I do know this. Buford's got a way of protecting people. The ranch. The boy. I've seen it myself. He's always been there when we needed him. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy in the air. Clay couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something far more significant than a missing child and a loyal dog. There was a connection here, one that stretched beyond what either of them could fully understand. The night had fallen over the Arizona ranch, casting long shadows across the rugged land. The moon rising above the jagged mountains bathed the desert in silver light. The vastness of the wilderness seemed to swallow up everything around it, including the ranch. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a peaceful, isolated place, but Sheriff Clay Forrester knew better. There was something ancient about this land, something that seemed to pulse beneath the earth itself. He had always felt it, even as a young man, but now after everything that had happened with Caleb, he couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. As the night deepened, Clay stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the darkened horizon. The air was still, and the only sounds were the rustling of the desert wind and the occasional howl of a coyote far off in the distance. Buford, ever vigilant, lay beneath the porch steps, his eyes, scanning the surroundings with an almost unnatural focus. The dog was more than just a guardian. He was the sentinel of a mystery that Clay could feel inching closer to him with each passing hour. Inside the ranch house was quiet. Scotty Dunton had gone to bed, no doubt exhausted from the events of the past 2 days. But Clay couldn't sleep. His mind raced, going over the journals, cryptic messages, the strange behaviors of Buford, and the inexplicable survival of Caleb. What was the connection? What had brought the dog and the boy together? And what was the meaning of the curse that the journal spoke of? The more he thought about it, the more convinced Clay became that the land itself held answers. But there was something else, something that seemed just out of reach. The ranch had been in the Dunton family for generations, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. Scotty had inherited it from his father and his father before him. The land had a history, a deep, unspoken history that was tied to the dog and the boy. Clay turned to Buford, who was still lying motionless, his gaze never wavering from the dark horizon. It was almost as if the dog was waiting for something that Clay could not yet understand. The sheriff had dealt with many mysteries in his career, but none quite like this. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that something momentous was about to unfold. Buford, Clay muttered under his breath as if the dog could understand him. "What are you guarding? What's so important about this land?" The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and for the first time that night Buford rose to his feet, his large frame casting a long shadow. The dog turned his head toward Clay, his amber eyes gleaming with an almost human intelligence. Then, without a sound, he padded silently into the night, disappearing into the dark expanse of the ranch. Clay didn't move for a moment, his eyes fixed on the spot where Buford had vanished. There was no doubt in Clay's mind now. The dog knew something he wasn't ready to share. Without hesitation, Clay grabbed his flashlight from the truck and followed Buford into the night. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant owl or the rustle of dry brush. Clay's boots crunched softly against the gravel as he made his way toward the farthest corner of the ranch, the area where Scotty had said he had found Caleb. It was there at the edge of the property that Buford had led the boy to safety. As Clay neared the area, he could just make out the silhouette of the dog, standing near the edge of a steep ravine, his body tense and alert. The sheriff slowed his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. Something told him that Buford had led him here for a reason. "What is it, boy?" Clay whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you want me to see?" Buford remained still, his gaze fixed on the ravine below. Clay approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the rocky outcrop that framed the canyon. The steep drop on the other side was treacherous, and there were signs of disturbed earth where someone or something had recently passed. Clay knelt down and examined the ground closely. The footprints were small, too small to be an adult's. They were the unmistakable marks of a child's feet leading straight toward the edge of the ravine. The sheriff's mind raced as he pieced together the events of the last 2 days. Caleb had wandered off alone, walking for miles through harsh terrain, with no one to guide him but Buford. And somehow the dog had brought the boy here to the very edge of the canyon. "What's down there?" Buford, Clay muttered, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The dog turned his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement, but remained silent. For a moment, Clay stood there, contemplating the significance of the discovery. Was this where the boy had first disappeared, or was this where something darker had taken place? His instincts told him there was more to this spot than met the eye. There was a sense of ancient power here, a force that seemed to have shaped the land long before the ranch had been established. "Whatever it is, we're going to find out," Clay said firmly, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. He stood up and turned to head back toward the ranch house, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered the first clue in a much larger mystery. A mystery that involved Buford Caleb and the land itself. The morning light came slowly creeping over the horizon as the desert began to stir. The stillness of the night gave way to the soft rustle of the wind, the chirping of distant birds, and the occasional scuffle of small animals in the brush. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, a reminder of the land's unyielding nature. Clay had barely slept the night before. His mind kept returning to the ravine, the footprints, and Buford's strange behavior. There was something profoundly unsettling about the place, something hidden beneath its rugged beauty. He couldn't shake the thought that whatever had drawn the dog to that spot was the key to understanding what had happened to Caleb. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to rest until he found them. As the sun climbed higher, Clay sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his gaze distant. Scotty had already gone out to check on the cattle, and the ranch house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the wind outside. But Clay could feel the weight of the land pressing against him as if it were watching, waiting for something. The sound of boots on the porch startled him, and he turned to see Scotty walking through the door, his weathered face drawn with concern. The rancher didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded toward the table where Clay had left the journal. Scotty had seen the journal before, but the sheriff had never spoken much about its contents. Today, however, felt different. Today, Clay had to ask the questions that had been swirling in his mind. Scotty Clay began, his voice low. "I need to know everything about this land. About the family history. Anything you can tell me that might help me understand what's been happening here. Something's going on, and I think it's tied to the ranch." Scotty stood silently for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the journal, then back to Clay. There was a heaviness in his gaze, as if he were debating whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed and sat down across from Clay, his broad hands resting on the table. "I've known for a long time that this ranch has a history, a strange history. My father used to talk about it when I was a boy. He told me stories about the land, about the people who lived here before us. Some of those stories were hard to believe, but he always swore they were true." Scotty paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something about this place, Sheriff. Something ancient." Clay leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Ancient? What do you mean?" "Before we settled here, this land was home to the Havasupai tribe," Scotty explained, his eyes distant. "They lived in the canyons, and they believed the land was sacred. They thought it was protected by spirits, by forces beyond what we can understand. When my father first bought this place, he heard the stories. People talked about strange happenings, mysterious disappearances, and the way the land seemed to watch you. But he didn't believe in that kind of thing. He was a practical man. But over time, I started to hear things. Odd sounds at night, animals acting strange things, disappearing without explanation." Clay's brow furrowed as he listened. "You think it's tied to the tribe, to their beliefs?" "I don't know," Scotty said, shaking his head. "But I've always wondered if there's something to those old stories. My father never told me much about them, but I could tell he believed in the land's power. I think he was afraid of it." "What does this have to do with Buford?" Clay asked, his mind racing. "The dog's behavior, it's like Hez guarding something. Something important." Scotty took a deep breath, his face grim. "I don't know if Buford's guarding anything, Sheriff. But I do know this: dogs like Buford have been with our family for generations. Anatolian Pyrenees are more than just protectors of livestock. They have a bond with the land. They sense things. Maybe it's the same thing that the Havasupai believed, a connection to something ancient. And maybe Buford is the key to understanding it. Clay stared at the rancher, processing what he had just heard. There was no doubt in his mind that there was something to this. The dog, the land, the strange events surrounding Caleb's disappearance, they were all linked in a way that defied simple explanation. I think Buford knows something, Clay said slowly. He's not just guarding the ranch, Scotty. He's guarding something deeper, something the land doesn't want to be disturbed. Scotty's eyes darkened. I've seen that look in his eyes before. It's like he's been called to do something, like he's been chosen. Clay stood up, his mind already racing ahead. We need to find out what that is. I am going back to the ravine today. I think there's something Buford was trying to show me. Scotty didn't protest. He had his own suspicions, and though he was reluctant to admit it, he knew that Clay was right. There was something on the ranch, something hidden beneath the surface, and it was tied to Buford in a way they still didn't fully understand. As Clay walked out of the house, the desert heat hit him like a wall. The land stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but there was a quiet strength in it, a sense of ancient power that seemed to linger in the air. He could feel it now more than ever. The land was alive with secrets, and he was determined to uncover them. Buford was already waiting by the truck, his large form a silent sentinel in the stillness of the desert. The sheriff approached the dog, his hand resting briefly on the dog's thick coat. "Let's find out what's going on, boy," Clay muttered, his voice firm. "Let's see what the land wants us to find." With that, he climbed into the truck and drove toward the ravine, with Buford following closely behind. The answers they were searching for were out there waiting, hidden in the heart of the wilderness. The morning light came slowly creeping over the horizon as the desert began to stir. The stillness of the night gave way to the soft rustle of the wind, the chirping of distant birds, and the occasional scuffle of small animals in the brush. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, a reminder of the land's unyielding nature. Clay had barely slept the night before. His mind kept returning to the ravine, the footprints, and Buford's strange behavior. There was something profoundly unsettling about the place, something hidden beneath its rugged beauty. He couldn't shake the thought that whatever had drawn the dog to that spot was the key to understanding what had happened to Caleb. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to rest until he found them. As the sun climbed higher, Clay sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his gaze distant. Scotty had already gone out to check on the cattle, and the ranch house was quiet except for the soft hum of the wind outside. But Clay could feel the weight of the land pressing against him, as if it were watching, waiting for something. The sound of boots on the porch startled him, and he turned to see Scotty walking through the door, his weathered face drawn with concern. The rancher didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded toward the table where Clay had left the journal. Scotty had seen the journal before, but the sheriff had never spoken much about its contents. Today, however, felt different. Today, Clay had to ask the questions that had been swirling in his mind. Scotty, Clay began, his voice low. "I need to know everything about this land. About the family history. Anything you can tell me that might help me understand what's been happening here. Something's going on, and I think it's tied to the ranch." Scotty stood silently for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the journal, then back to Clay. There was a heaviness in his gaze, as if he were debating whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed and sat down across from Clay, his broad hands resting on the table. "I've known for a long time that this ranch has a history, a strange history. My father used to talk about it when I was a boy. He told me stories about the land, about the people who lived here before us. Some of those stories were hard to believe, but he always swore they were true." Scotty paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something about this place, Sheriff. Something ancient." Clay leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Ancient? What do you mean?" "Before we settled here, this land was home to the Havasupai tribe," Scotty explained, his eyes distant. "They lived in the canyons, and they believed the land was sacred. They thought it was protected by spirits, by forces beyond what we can understand. When my father first bought this place, he heard the stories. People talked about strange happenings, mysterious disappearances, and the way the land seemed to watch you. But he didn't believe in that kind of thing. He was a practical man. But over time, I started to hear things. Odd sounds at night. Animals acting strange things, disappearing without explanation. Clay's brow furrowed as he listened. You think it's tied to the tribe, to their beliefs? I don't know, Scotty said, shaking his head. But I've always wondered if there's something to those old stories. My father never told me much about them, but I could tell he believed in the land's power. I think he was afraid of it. What does this have to do with Buford? Clay asked, his mind racing. The dog's behavior, it's like Hez guarding something. Something important. Scotty took a deep breath, his face grim. I don't know if Buford's guarding anything, Sheriff. But I do know this dogs like Buford have been with our family for generations. Anatolian Pyrenees are more than just protectors of livestock. They have a bond with the land. They sense things. Maybe it's the same thing that the Havasupai believed, a connection to something ancient. And maybe Buford is the key to understanding it. Clay stared at the rancher, processing what he had just heard. There was no doubt in his mind that there was something to this. The dog, the land, the strange events surrounding Caleb's disappearance, they were all linked in a way that defied simple explanation. I think Buford knows something. Clay said slowly. His not just guarding the ranch, Scotty. His guarding something deeper, something the land doesn't want to be disturbed. Scotty's eyes darkened. I've seen that look in his eyes before. It's like he's been called to do something, like he's been chosen. Clay stood up, his mind already racing ahead. We need to find out what that is. I am going back to the ravine today. I think there's something Buford was trying to show me. Scotty didn't protest. He had his own suspicions, and though he was reluctant to admit it, he knew that Clay was right. There was something on the ranch, something hidden beneath the surface, and it was tied to Buford in a way they still didn't fully understand. As Clay walked out of the house, the desert heat hit him like a wall. The land stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but there was a quiet strength in it, a sense of ancient power that seemed to linger in the air. He could feel it now more than ever. The land was alive with secrets, and he was determined to uncover them. Buford was already waiting by the truck, his large form, a silent sentinel in the stillness of the desert. The sheriff approached the dog, his hand resting briefly on the dog's thick coat. Let's find out what's going on, boy, Clay muttered, his voice firm. Let's see what the land wants us to find. With that, he climbed into the truck and drove toward the ravine, with Buford following closely behind. The answers they were searching for were out there waiting, hidden in the heart of the wilderness. The truck rumbled over the uneven ground as Clay steered it toward the ravine, with Buford trotting alongside. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long stretched shadows over the desert. The silence of the wilderness was deafening, broken only by the sound of the truck's tires crunching on the gravel and the occasional distant call of a bird. Clay's mind was focused on the task ahead, but there was a sense of unease settling in his stomach. He had been a sheriff long enough to know when something wasn't right, when the air around him felt charged, like it was about to crack open and reveal something hidden beneath the surface. That was the feeling he had now. As they neared the ravine, Clay slowed the truck to a stop and climbed out, taking a deep breath. The desert air was dry and warm, but there was an odd stillness in the atmosphere that made him uneasy. It felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Beside him, Buford stood still, his ears pricked, and his gaze fixed on the ravine below. "All right, boy," Clay muttered, casting a glance at the dog. "Let's see what you're guarding." He made his way toward the edge of the ravine, with Buford following closely behind. The drop was steep, and the rocks around the rim were jagged, making it difficult to approach without care. As Clay descended slowly, he kept his eyes trained on the ground below, looking for any sign of the disturbance he had felt the night before. The further he went, the more the land seemed to change. The vegetation became sparse, and the earth beneath his feet turned to loose gravel. It was as if he were walking into a place that had been untouched for centuries, a place that had no interest in being discovered. Buford's growls broke the silence, low and rumbling, as the dog suddenly froze, his body tense. Clay's heart skipped a beat. He followed the dog's gaze and froze himself. There, just a few yards ahead, was something he had not expected. A large, flat rock covered with symbols. At first, Clay thought it was just a natural formation. But as he approached, he realized that the rock was carved, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to swirl and interlock in ways that defied logic. They were not like anything Clay had ever seen before, not in any of the old books or historical records. The carvings were deep and worn, weathered by time, but their presence was undeniable. This wasn't here before, Clay whispered, kneeling down beside the rock. Buford circled the rock, his eyes never leaving it. The dog's behavior was strange, as if he was wary of the symbols, as though the land itself was warning them. Clay traced his fingers over the carvings, feeling the rough texture of the stone. There was something almost alive about it, as if it were responding to his touch. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy, and for a moment he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A shiver ran down his spine. Clay stood up, his pulse quickening. "What are you trying to show me, Buford?" he muttered, his voice barely audible against the silence of the canyon. For a long moment nothing moved. Then slowly the earth beneath him seemed to tremble. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but Clay felt it, a deep, resonating vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Buford's growls intensified, and he took a step back, his eyes wide with concern. The sheriff's hand instinctively went to his holster, but he didn't draw his gun. He wasn't sure why, but something in his gut told him this wasn't a threat he could fight with bullets. This was something older, something that had been here long before humans ever set foot on this land. The ground shook again, stronger this time, and Clay stumbled, catching himself on the rock. The carvings on the stone seemed to pulse with life, the lines glowing faintly as though they were absorbing the energy from the earth itself. The air around them grew thick, oppressive, and Clay could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Buford barked sharply, pulling Clay from his dazed state. The dog was now standing between him and the stone, his body braced in a protective stance, as if he were guarding the sheriff from something. "Buford, what is it?" Clay asked, his voice tense with a mix of fear and confusion. The dog growled again. His eyes locked on the stone, and for a moment it felt as if the entire world had stopped moving. The air was still, but the tension was unbearable. It was as though something was waking, something that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Suddenly there was a sound, a low, rumbling growl that echoed from deep within the canyon. Clay's eyes widened in disbelief. It wasn't Buford. It wasn't even a mountain lion. This was something different, something older. From the darkness of the ravine, a figure appeared, not human, not animal, but something in between. It was tall, its form shadowed and indistinct, and its eyes glowed with a faint ethereal light. It moved toward them slowly, its presence heavy, as if the very air around it thickened with each step. Buford barked and lunged forward, standing protectively in front of Clay. The dog's body was rigid, but he didn't back down. Clay's heart raced in his chest. This was it. This was the moment. The moment when the land, the history, and the power of the wilderness came together in one overwhelming force. The figure paused, watching them, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "What are you?" Clay whispered, his voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised its hand, and Clay felt a surge of energy wash over him, as if the very earth beneath his feet was alive and sending a message directly to his soul. The symbols on the rock flared to life, glowing brighter with each passing second. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The land returned to stillness. The shaking stopped. The air lightened. But something had changed. Something in the very fabric of the desert had shifted. Clay stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Buford, too, was motionless, his body still braced in a protective stance, his gaze fixed on the now empty ravine. What just happened?" Clay murmured, his heart still pounding. Buford lowered his head, his tail stiff. The dog was no longer growling, but there was a sense of unease in the air. The silence was deafening, and Clay knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. The awakening had begun. The morning sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over the vast expanse of the Arizona wilderness. Clay stood in front of the ravine, his eyes still scanning the jagged rocks where the strange encounter had unfolded the night before. His thoughts were swirling, a mixture of disbelief and fear as he tried to process what had happened. Buford sat quietly by his side, his fur still bristling, his gaze distant. The dog had been on edge all morning, as if something unseen was tugging at the very air around them. Clay had spent the better part of the night trying to make sense of the bizarre incident, but the more he thought about it, the more questions arose. "What did I see last night?" Buford Clay asked, his voice hoarse. "And what does it mean for us?" Buford turned his head slightly. his eyes meeting Clay's with a knowing intensity. The dog had always been a mystery, a creature of instinct and purpose, but now in the aftermath of that otherworldly encounter, it seemed as though there was more to Buford than Clay had ever imagined. The way the dog had reacted, the way he had instinctively protected Clay from whatever had emerged from the ravine, it was as if Buford knew something the sheriff didn't. Clay's mind wandered back to the strange symbols on the rock. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were important, that they were a key to understanding whatever had just happened. But what did they mean, and who or what had been watching them from the shadows of the canyon? "Looks like we've got a long road ahead, boy," Clay muttered, turning his gaze back to the ravine. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." As he spoke, Clay felt a pull in his chest, a nagging sense of urgency. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now his gut was telling him that there was more to this mystery than just an odd encounter in the desert. The symbols, the figure, the energy in the air, it all felt like a warning, a prelude to something far greater than anything he had ever faced. But Clay wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not when it came to protecting his land and the people he cared about. If this was some kind of threat, he would find it and face it head on. And if there were answers to be found, he was determined to uncover them no matter what it took. With a deep breath, Clay climbed back into his truck, and Buford hopped up beside him, his large frame settling comfortably in the seat. The sheriff started the engine, the truck roaring to life, as they began their journey deeper into the wilderness. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Clay was no longer alone in this fight. Buford was his companion, his protector, and whatever force had emerged from the ravine was not something Clay would face without the dog by his side. As they drove further into the desert, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sky, once clear and blue, was now overcast, and the wind picked up, kicking dust into the air. The scent of dry earth mixed with something else, something foreign. It lingered on the breeze as though the very atmosphere was charged with energy. Clay knew they were heading into uncharted territory. He had patrolled these lands for years, but this was different. The landscape had shifted overnight, and the world around him felt unfamiliar, almost alien. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Clay said aloud, his voice resolute. "No matter what we find, we'll face it together." Buford gave a soft growl as if in agreement, and the sheriff couldn't help but smile. The dog had always been a rock steady and unwavering, and he was grateful for that now more than ever. Hours passed as they navigated the rough terrain, the landscape changing with each mile. The deep canyons and towering rock formations gave way to sparse vegetation and rocky hills. The sun was high now, casting harsh shadows and creating a shimmering heat on the horizon. Yet despite the oppressive heat, the air felt strangely cool, almost refreshing. As they approached a narrow pass between two cliffs, Clay slowed the truck. The road ahead was blocked by a large pile of boulders that had fallen from the cliffs above. It was impossible to continue without clearing the debris, and Clay knew that would take time. "Looks like we're gonna have to make camp here," Clay said, glancing at Buford. "Well, rest for the night, and take care of the mess in the morning." Buford let out a low whine, his ears alert, and Clay followed the dog's gaze toward the cliffs. There was something about the area that seemed off, as if the land was hiding something beneath its surface. Clay unpacked his gear, setting up camp as the shadows grew longer. The sounds of the wilderness were quiet, the usual chirps of birds and rustling of animals silenced by the oppressive atmosphere. It was as though the desert itself had gone still, watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and Clay sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He knew they weren't alone. The feeling of being watched had only intensified since the previous night, and now it seemed as though the land itself was conspiring against them. Buford lay close by his eyes, scanning the darkness beyond the campfire. The dog's posture was rigid, his senses heightened. Whatever was out there, Buford knew it was close. "Stay alert, boy," Clay murmured, his gaze flickering around the darkened landscape. "We might not be the only ones searching tonight." The wind picked up again, carrying with it a strange, almost haunting sound. It was faint at first, like the whisper of something far away. But as it grew louder, Clay's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something moving, something large, something that didn't belong in a desert. Buford's growls grew louder, and Clay's hand instinctively went to his gun. But before he could react, the ground beneath them trembled once more. this time stronger than before. The earth seemed to shake with a force that rattled the very air around them. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. A figure not entirely human, but something far older, far more powerful. It stepped forward, its form emerging from the darkness, like a shadow brought to life. The creature's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its presence filled the air with an energy that was both overwhelming and terrifying. Clay's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this figure before last night in the ravine, and now it had come to find him. Clay's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature before him moved with an unnatural grace, its dark, shadowy form blending into the surroundings, like a specter from the depths of the desert itself. Its eyes glowing faintly bore into Clay's soul, and he felt an inexplicable pull, one that kept him rooted in place despite every instinct telling him to run. Buford, however, was not frozen. The Anatolian Pyrenees stood between Clay and the creature, his muscles tense, growling low but steadily. The dog's protective instinct was undeniable. Buford would not allow any harm to come to his master. His low growl filled the air, mixing with the howling desert wind, creating an eerie symphony of primal energy. The creature, whatever it was, stopped just short of the campfire's light, its eyes never leaving Clay's. There was an unsettling silence between them, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of the wind through the desert brush. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment it was as if time itself had stopped. Clay's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. The creature's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, there was a pressure, like a weight settling on Clay's chest, pushing him to his knees. He could feel the air thickening, the temperature dropping, as the creature's presence seemed to expand, pressing in on every side. The shadows seemed to grow longer, as though they were stretching out from the creature's form, wrapping around the landscape like a dark cloak. But then, in an instant, the weight lifted. The creature stepped forward, its movement like liquid flowing through the darkness, as though it were part of the very earth beneath their feet. Clay's breath caught his instinct, screaming to run, but he couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, locked in place by the sheer force of the creature's presence. Buford snarled, stepping forward to block the creature's path. The dog's teeth were bared, his body tense, but still the creature did not move, as though it were waiting for something. Clay could feel the animal's fury and the deep bond between him and the dog. The bond was something rare, something that only deepened in moments like this. The bond between a man and his dog in the face of danger. "What do you want?" Clay said again, his voice steadier now, his hand still gripping his gun. The creature's glowing eyes flickered, almost as if it were considering him. Then, without warning, it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, vanishing from sight as quickly as it had appeared. Clay blinked, his breath coming in short, erratic bursts as he scanned the darkness. Had it really been here? Had it really spoken to him? Or had he imagined it? The desert was notorious for playing tricks on the mind, especially when one had been exposed to its harsh elements for too long. But there was something in his gut, a gnawing feeling that told him it was no trick. Buford continued to growl, his body rigid, eyes scanning the empty desert around them. The tension in the air lingered, the feeling of being watched intensifying. It was as if the land itself was aware of their presence, as if the earth was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a move. Clay swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing heart. He had seen things before, things that didn't make sense, things that defied explanation, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. This wasn't just a random encounter with some wild animal. This was something far more sinister, something ancient and powerful. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. "We're not alone out here, are we?" Buford Clay murmured, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. Buford gave a soft whine in response, his ears flat against his head. The dog was unnerved, and that was something Clay didn't take lightly. Buford had been through countless dangers with him. Rattlesnakes, coyotes, mountain lions. But this was different. This felt like something that defied nature itself. As the minutes ticked by, Clay slowly began to regain control of his senses. The immediate threat, whatever it was, seemed to have retreated, but the unease lingered like a dark cloud hovering over them. The fire's light flickered, casting long shadows across the desert floor, and Clay could swear he saw something moving in the distance. But when he squinted, nothing was there. "Stay close," Buford Clay muttered, his voice steady, even though his nerves were still taut with fear. "We need to get moving. We can't stay here. Not with that thing out there." Buford remained at his side, his eyes darting to every corner of the campsite, ever vigilant, ever watchful. They were in dangerous territory now, and the dog knew it. Clay packed up his gear, moving quickly but quietly. He didn't know what they had just encountered, but he wasn't about to stay and wait for it to come back. The land was too vast, too wild, and whatever that creature was, it wasn't the kind of thing that would just leave him alone. He had to find answers, and fast. Once everything was packed, Clay climbed into the truck, and Buford hopped up into the passenger seat. The sheriff's eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the shadows grow longer as the truck rumbled to life. They were heading deeper into the wilderness now, but something in Clay's gut told him that the answers they were searching for were just ahead. The creature, the mysterious symbols, the strange energy, they were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. And Clay had a feeling that solving this puzzle would lead them to something that could change everything. Clay drove through the Arizona wilderness, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. The encounter with the mysterious creature had shaken him, but it had also ignited a deep curiosity. What was it? Why had it come to him, to them? And why now? Buford sat quietly beside him, his large frame occupying the passenger seat. The dog's alertness never wavered, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, even as the truck rumbled along the dirt road. The world outside seemed to grow darker with each passing mile, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. It was an unforgiving land, a place where survival was a daily challenge, but now it felt even more hostile, more alive with danger. Clay had been a sheriff long enough to know that this land could hide many secrets. He had seen things in his years of service: smugglers, poachers, and even rare cases of people who vanished without a trace. But this was different. This wasn't some criminal hiding in the brush. No, this was something far more ancient, something that didn't belong in the modern world. The words of the creature echoed in his mind. "You are not the first to search." What did that mean? Was there something he was missing? Clay had never been one to believe in myths or legends, but the way the creature had spoken, the weight of its presence, it was impossible to ignore. He had to find out more. The first step was to head to the local library in Seligman. The small, dusty building was an oasis of knowledge in an otherwise desolate town filled with old books and forgotten stories. Clay had spent countless hours there during his tenure as sheriff, researching missing persons, old cases, and the town's history. But this time, he wasn't looking for criminals. He wasn't searching for a simple explanation. He needed answers, real answers. When Clay and Buford arrived at the library, the doors creaked open, revealing the familiar scent of aged paper and leather. The librarian, a kindly woman named Mrs. Avery, greeted them with a nod. "Clay, what brings you by this time of night?" she asked, adjusting her glasses as she peered at him over the top of the desk. "I need to look into something, Mrs. Avery." "Something unusual," Clay replied, his voice low. "Do you have anything on local legends, strange occurrences, that sort of thing?" Mrs. Avery raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She motioned toward the back of the library. "You'll want the old archives. There's a section in the back where we keep some of the more unusual stories. It's not much, but I've seen some strange things there over the years." Clay nodded in thanks and headed toward the archives. Buford, as always, followed close behind his paws, soft against the wooden floor. The section was tucked away in the far corner, nearly forgotten by time. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty old books, yellowed pages, and weathered journals. As Clay pulled out a few books and began flipping through them, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the library, it was something else, something deeper. The first few books were disappointingly mundane. Tales of outlaws, Native American tribes, and the early history of Seligman. But then, one book caught his eye. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn from years of neglect. The title was simple, The Wilderness Whisperers. Curious Clay opened the book and began reading. It was written in a hand that was old, but still legible. The entries described encounters with strange creatures, beasts that roam the wilderness, creatures with glowing eyes that seemed to appear and vanish at will. They were described as protectors of the land, ancient guardians that had been watching over the desert long before settlers had arrived. Clay's brow furrowed as he read on. The journal described a creature, much like the one he had encountered, a being that would appear to those who were lost, guiding them through the harsh wilderness and keeping them safe from harm. But there was a catch. These creatures only appeared to those who were worthy, those who had a deep connection to the land, and once they appeared, they would never leave. Their presence would forever bind the person to the wilderness, changing them in ways that couldn't be explained. The more Clay read, the more unsettled he became. This journal didn't just describe an animal. It described a force of nature, something that transcended the ordinary world. It spoke of ancient rituals of beings that existed outside the realm of normal understanding, and of a sacred bond between humans and the earth. The journal ended abruptly with a final entry that sent a chill down Clay's spine. It read, "I have seen it again, the creature that walks with the lost. It knows what I have learned, and it will not let me leave. I can feel the pull, the bond growing stronger with each passing day. There is no escape now. The desert has claimed me, and I am not the first." Clay slammed the book shut, his mind racing. Was this the same creature? Was it really a guardian, a protector of the land? And why had it appeared to him? Was he the one it was seeking, or was there something else at play here? Buford whined softly beside him, as if sensing the shift in his thoughts. Clay took a deep breath and stood up. He had come for answers, and he had found something far more complex than he had expected. The creature, the journal, the symbols, it was all connected, and the path forward was clearer than ever. He had to return to the wilderness. He had to understand what was happening before it was too late. As he walked toward the door, Mrs. Avery called out from behind him, "Clay, be careful out there. Not everything in those pages should be taken as truth. The desert holds many secrets, and some are better left undisturbed." Clay nodded, but the warning barely registered. He had already made up his mind. The answers lay out there in the desert, and with Buford by his side, he would find them. The desert was colder now, the night air biting at Clay's skin as he and Buford made their way back toward the wilderness. The truck rumbled steadily over the dirt roads, but it felt like they were heading toward something far more significant than just another search. The weight of what they had uncovered at the library pressed heavily on Clay's mind. The journal had given him some answers, but it had also opened up even more questions. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just some random animal. It was part of something much older, something tied to the very fabric of the land itself. Clay couldn't help but wonder, was he meant to be a part of this? The journal had said that those who were worthy were chosen, but worthy of what? And what would happen once the creature's presence truly bound him to the wilderness? Buford's steady breathing beside him was a comforting presence in the midst of the storm of questions. The dog was no stranger to the harsh realities of the desert. He had walked this land countless times with Clay, and in some strange way, it felt like Buford had always known more about the land than Clay ever could. There was a deep connection between the two of them, one forged through years of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. As they neared the edge of the land that Clay owned, the familiar landscape began to shift. The rolling hills and rocky outcroppings gave way to a dense thicket of scrubrush and tall, dry grasses. It was the kind of terrain where the shadows played tricks on your mind, where every movement in the distance could be something or someone waiting in the darkness. And it was here that Clay felt the change. The air was thick with tension, as if the very earth beneath their feet had started to hum with an energy that wasn't entirely natural. They stopped near the base of a large rock formation. Clay could see the faint outline of the mountains in the distance, their peaks jutting into the starry sky. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over everything, turning the desert into a vast, haunting expanse. Buford's hackles were raised, his eyes scanning the surroundings with an intensity that Clay had never seen before. The dog let out a low growl, his body tense. Clay's hand instinctively went to the grip of his gun, his senses heightened. "What is it, boy?" Clay muttered, but the dog didn't respond. Buford's gaze was fixed on something in the distance, a shadow that seemed to shift in the wind, a presence just out of reach. Clay could feel it too now, that pull, the one he had felt before in the presence of the creature. A rustle came from the brush behind them, and Clay spun around, his gun at the ready. Buford stepped forward, his growl deepening. But there was nothing there, nothing but the wind moving through the dry grass. Clay's heart raced, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "I am not losing my mind," Clay whispered to himself. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. Something was out there. Something was watching them. He turned back toward the mountains, his eyes narrowing. If the creature was out there, it was waiting for him to make the next move. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to understand what it wanted, what it was, and what had made it come to him now. "Come on, Buford," Clay muttered, urging the dog forward. Buford didn't need any encouragement. He was already leading the way, his body coiled and ready to spring into action. The dog had sensed something long before Clay had even acknowledged it, and now together they would uncover the truth. The wind kicked up as they began to walk, carrying with it the scent of the earth, the dry dust and the faint traces of something else, something unnatural. The closer they got to the mountains, the stronger the feeling became. It wasn't just the land that felt alive now. The very air seemed charged, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they made their way through the terrain, Clay's mind raced. The creature had spoken to him, but it hadn't said much. Its words had been cryptic, leaving behind more questions than answers. What was it trying to communicate, and why had it appeared to him of all people? There had to be a reason for it. He could feel it in his bones. The moonlight bathed the rocky landscape in a silver glow, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers reaching for the horizon. It was then that Clay saw it. In the distance, just beyond the edge of a narrow ravine, was a figure standing still, watching them. The silhouette was too distinct to be a trick of the light. It was human in shape, but too tall, too elongated to be normal. Clay's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when everything changed. He tightened his grip on the gun, his mind racing. Was this the creature? Or was it something else entirely? Buford growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the still air. The dog took a step forward, but Clay held him back. "Stay close, boy," Clay whispered, his eyes locked on the figure ahead. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Then, without warning, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately toward them. Clay's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to flee, but he couldn't. He had come too far to turn back now. He needed answers, and whatever was out there, whatever was watching him, had them. The figure stepped into the light of the moon, revealing a face that was both familiar and terrifying. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. But there was something wrong about him. His eyes were dark and hollow, as if they had seen things no human eyes should ever have to see. And his skin, it was pale, almost sickly, like it had been bleached by the sun and the wind. Clay's stomach churned as the man drew closer. He could feel the weight of the desert's secrets pressing in on him, threatening to consume him whole. But he couldn't back down now. "I've been waiting for you, Clay," the man said, his voice raspy and cold, as though it had been dragged from the depths of some forgotten grave. The words echoed through the still desert night, cutting through the tension that had been building since Clay had first felt the creature's presence. The man before him, this strange and unsettling figure, continued to move slowly, his every step measured as if he had all the time in the world. Clay's grip on his gun tightened, but something in his gut told him that it wasn't going to help. This wasn't a confrontation he could solve with force. "Who are you?" Clay asked, his voice steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. He needed answers, answers to all of the questions that had been haunting him, for days, for weeks, even longer. The man stopped just a few feet in front of Clay, his hollow eyes staring deep into his soul. There was an unsettling stillness about him, as if he wasn't entirely human, or perhaps he wasn't entirely alive. "You know who I am," the man replied with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been waiting for you." Clay's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He felt a surge of both fear and recognition. There was something about the man's presence that felt too familiar, as if he had seen him before. But where? When the man's grin grew, as if he could read Clay's thoughts. "Don't strain yourself. You won't remember me until the time is right. But know this, I am not your enemy, Clay. I am here to show you the path." Clay took a step back, his mind reeling. "The path? What are you talking about? Who are you, really?" The man's expression softened, his gaze shifting briefly toward the ground. "I am the one who was called to the land long before you came. The land has chosen you, Clay. You and your dog Buford. This desert. It speaks to you now. It wants you to understand, to accept the truth of what it is and what it's been hiding. Clay was still trying to process everything. The desert, the land, his connection to it. What did all of this mean? He had felt a strange pull. Yes, but this was something entirely different. And yet the man's words resonated with a deep part of him, a part he didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. Buford, sensing Clay's confusion, stepped closer, his hackles still raised. The dog's growl was quiet but constant, a low rumble of warning. It was clear that Buford didn't trust the man, and if Buford didn't trust him, Clay certainly didn't either. What's your connection to this land? Clay demanded, his voice growing more urgent. You're not some ghost or spirit. What do you want from me? The man's lips curled into a knowing smile, as if the question itself amused him. He looked up at the sky, his expression distant, as if the answers lay somewhere far beyond the land around them. I am neither ghost nor spirit, Clay. I am something else, something older. I have walked this land for many lifetimes, watching, waiting. I have no need for your understanding. All that matters is that the time has come. The land has spoken to you, chosen you, and now it is time for you to embrace your role. Clay could barely breathe. The weight of the man's words pressed down on him, the enormity of what was being said crashing over him like a wave. The land had chosen him. But why? What role did it want him to play? Was he really just a pawn in something much larger than himself? And what was this time that the man kept mentioning? Before he could voice his next question, the man raised a hand, silencing him. The creature you've sensed, the presence that has been following you. It is part of the land's will. The land is alive, Clay. It's ancient, and it has called you, chosen you to carry out its purpose. But be warned, the truth is not easy to accept. Once you step onto this path, there is no turning back. Clay's mind spun. He had felt it, the call to connection to something deeper, something beyond the physical world. He had been struggling to understand it, but now it seemed as though he was being told that his purpose had already been written, that his life, his fate, was not his own. The desert around him seemed to close, and the winds picking up, swirling the dust into the air. The man's eyes locked onto Clay's with an intensity that made him shiver. Buford will help guide you. The man continued, his voice low and steady. The dog, your companion, is not just an animal. He is your protector, your connection to the land. He will help you face the creature that calls this land home. And once you confront it, the land will reveal its secrets to you. Clay's thoughts were a jumbled mess, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the unknown, stretching out before him, ready to pull him in. The creature? What was it? What did it want from him? And why had it come now? You think I am ready for this? Clay's voice was hoarse with disbelief. I am not a chosen one, and I am certainly not some hero. I am just a rancher. The man smiled again, his expression softening. You may not see it now, Clay, but the land has always known. You are the one who can understand it, who can hear its call. You and Buford are bound to it in ways you can't even begin to comprehend. And now it is time to find out what that means. The winds howled around them as the man turned and began walking away, disappearing into the night as though he had never been there at all. Clay stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing to catch up with everything that had just been said. But when he blinked, the man was gone, leaving only the desert's cold embrace and the distant stars above. Clay looked down at Buford, who was still standing next to him, his ears perked and his gaze unwavering. Well, I guess we have some answers, Clay muttered, though. The weight of those answers only raised more questions. And I think we're going to need a hell of a lot more. The days following the strange encounter with the man in the desert left Clay with more questions than answers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's hollow eyes and heard his cryptic words echoing in his mind. The land has chosen you and Buford. Now it is time to face what is hidden. Clay couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him, the land, the animals, the very air, was charged with something ancient, something powerful. The sense of destiny that the man had spoken about clung to him like a second skin. But with each passing moment, the mystery only deepened. Buford was more than just a dog. The connection between them had always been strong, but now it felt as if the bond had grown even deeper. The dog's eyes, wise and knowing, seemed to understand something that Clay didn't. They had been drawn into something much larger than a simple search and rescue mission. The land had chosen them. But why? The sky was a pale blue, the early morning sun just beginning to rise over the Arizona desert. Clay stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the rugged terrain. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, yet it felt like the calm before a storm. Something was coming. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Buford stood by his side, his body tense, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dog's instincts were sharper than Clay's, and if he sensed danger, Clay knew it was close. "All right, boy," Clay said softly, though his voice felt strangely hollow, as if the words were escaping him. "Time to figure out what's going on here." The rancher turned toward the dense brush that bordered his land. He had no real plan, only a gut feeling that led him in a direction that he couldn't ignore. The desert was vast, and the creature that the man had spoken of was still a mystery. But Clay was determined. It was time to confront whatever was waiting for him. As they made their way deeper into the wild terrain, the weight of the situation grew heavier with every step. The land was alive, just as the man had said. It seemed to pulse beneath their feet as if it were waiting for something. Waiting for them. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of the desert chirping insects, rustling leaves, the distant cry of a coyote were gone. It was as if the world had frozen in place, holding its breath. The air was thick with anticipation. "Stay close," Buford Clay murmured, his hand resting on the dog's back. The dog's muscles were tense, his ears alert. They were nearing something they couldn't see but could both feel. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but it was enough to make Clay's heart skip a beat. He glanced at Buford, who was standing still, his body rigid with focus. The dog had sensed something that Clay couldn't. And then it appeared a shadow on the horizon, a shape moving swiftly across the barren land. It was large, moving with an unnatural grace, its form blending with the landscape in a way that defied logic. The air seemed to hum with energy. As the creature came closer, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Clay froze. His pulse quickened and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. The creature wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. It wasn't a mountain lion or a bear, though it resembled a wild animal in some way, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes were the only part of its form that seemed real, and they stared at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Buford growled low in his throat, but Clay could see the fear in the dog's eyes. This wasn't just any threat. This was something far beyond their understanding. "Stay behind me," Buford Clay ordered, his voice shaky but firm. The dog moved closer, pressing against his legs as they both watched the creature approach. The air around them seemed to thicken the weight of the moment, pressing in from all sides. Time seemed to stretch each second, feeling like an eternity. The creature was closer now, its shape becoming clearer, but still shrouded in an eerie mist. The silence that had fallen over the desert was deafening, broken only by the sound of Clay's heartbeat thundering in his ears. And then the creature spoke, not with words, but with a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the earth beneath them. It was as though the land itself was speaking through the creature, and Clay could feel the ground beneath his feet tremble. "You are here," the creature rumbled, its voice low and echoing. "In the air. You have come to claim your place. You are the one the land has chosen. But can you face the truth?" Clay's stomach turned. The truth? What truth, and why had it chosen him? "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking through the tension. "What do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head, its eyes glowing brighter. "I am the land, the soul of the earth itself. I have been waiting for someone strong enough to hear my call, someone who can understand what lies beneath this land, beneath this world. But you are not ready, Clay. You must prove your worth." Buford's growl grew louder, and Clay felt a surge of protective instinct. He wouldn't let the creature harm his dog no matter what. "You've already taken enough from this land," Clay said, his voice growing more confident. "I am not afraid of you." The creature's gaze shifted to Buford, its eyes narrowing. "Ah, the dog. Your companion. You think he can protect you. He is only a messenger, a guide. He can't save you from what lies ahead." Clay's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't raise it. The creature was right about one thing. It wasn't just about physical strength or weapons. The land had chosen him for something else, something deeper. And whatever the creature was, whatever it wanted, he would have to confront it, face it head on. "Then show me what I am supposed to do," Clay said, his voice firm with resolve. "Show me the truth." The creature's eyes flickered, as if considering his words. Then, without warning, it stepped forward, its massive form filling the space between them. The ground trembled beneath its feet, and Clay could feel the pressure building in the air. "This is your final test, Clay," the creature growled. "Survive, or be consumed." The morning of April 17th, 2025, dawned over Seligman, Arizona with deceptive calm. The sun climbed slowly over the red rocks and sparse desert vegetation, casting long shadows that danced in the golden light. Clay Walker, the weathered rancher who had taken in little Noah after his miraculous survival in the wilderness, stood outside his barn, coffee in hand. Buford, the Anatolian Pyrenees, lay nearby, his massive head resting on his paws, eyes scanning the horizon. Noah had slept peacefully for the first time since the ordeal. The child's resilience had stunned the community, especially given his age. At just 2 years old, he had walked 7 miles through treacherous terrain braving predators, and the cold desert night guided and guarded by Buford. Now safe in Clay's home, the boy seemed to have found a strange sense of peace. Sheriff Lisa Harrow had returned that morning to check in her dusty cruiser, pulling up the gravel driveway. "Morning, Clay," she greeted him, glancing at the dog. "Still can't believe this one. You got a hero here." "Yup," Clay said, nodding toward Buford. "I don't know what made him stick with that boy, but he wasn't leaving him behind." Lisa leaned against the fence, watching Buford. "We're still trying to piece together his path. But what's sure is, without this big guy, Noah might never have made it." Later that day, Clay brought Noah outside. The boy was quieter than most toddlers, his wide blue eyes curious but cautious. Clay had learned to speak gently and let the boy set his own pace. As Noah tottered over to Buford, the dog lifted his head and gave a single soft huff of greeting. Noah smiled. "You like him, huh?" Clay asked. Noah nodded. Buford stayed, he not leave. Those words, simple and pure, brought a lump to Clay's throat. Sheriff Lisa, who had overheard from the porch, met Clay's eyes. "He remembers." "Yes," Clay said, "and I think Buford does too." That evening, Clay sat with Noah on his lap and a photo album open in front of them. The boy pointed to one of the old photos. Mama Clay gently turned the page. "We'll find her son." "They're still looking. You hold on." By the morning of April 18th, the town of Seligman had become a media magnet. Reporters stood by the roadside, broadcasting the feel-good survival story that had captivated the nation. But for Clay, the attention was unwelcome. He declined interviews and kept Noah close, shielding him from the cameras. At the sheriff's office, Lisa Harrow was busy cross-referencing missing persons databases. Noah's family still hadn't been identified, and questions lingered. How had he wandered so far alone? Who had been watching him? A new clue arrived that morning. A hiker found a child's toy truck near an old ATV trail, about 2 miles from where Noah was found. Clay accompanied Lisa to the site. Buford came too. As they approached the area, the dog's posture changed, alert, focused. He led them to a ravine with fresh boot prints. "Someone else was out here," Lisa muttered. "And recently." Clay's jaw tightened. "Then this ain't over." That afternoon, Clay and Lisa reviewed satellite maps. The boot prints suggested someone may have been watching from a distance, possibly even abandoning Noah intentionally. The child's placement didn't seem like an accident anymore. Clay took Buford out again, this time to a separate canyon ridge. They had barely gone half a mile when Buford stopped, sniffed the air, and barked once. They found an old campsite, extinguished fire pit, torn blanket, and footprints heading west. Clay took photos with his phone. "Someone camped here not too long ago. We might be tracking whoever left Noah." Lisa radioed in the coordinates. "Well, need a forensic team." Back at the ranch, Noah clung to Buford, even sleeping with his small hand buried in the dog's fur. Buford, in return, never left his side. The morning of April 19th began with a restless energy. Storm clouds gathered in the distance. Clay, sensing something was about to shift, reinforced the barn and brought Buford inside early. Just before sundown, Lisa arrived again, this time with news. The prints match a known offender, guy named Travis Knoll. History of neglect and off-grid living. We think he's Noah's biological father. Clay was stunned. Why would he leave him like that? We think he panicked. There was a domestic call from a neighbor 2 nights before Noah went missing. Noel took off before we arrived. He might have thought leaving Noah in the wilderness was safer than getting caught. Clay shook his head, heart heavy. That boy didn't deserve that. Lightning forked across the horizon as thunder rolled in. Clay looked at Buford, who stood at the door, ears forward. "Storm's coming," Buford growled low. Lisa reached for her radio. "We need to move fast." As the sun sets over the Arizona wilderness, we are left with a story that touches the deepest parts of the human spirit. Buford, a quiet ranch dog with a big heart, didn't ask for praise. He didn't do it for recognition. He simply saw a child in need and stayed by his side. In a world often filled with noise and distraction, Buford reminds us that sometimes the purest acts of love come in silence. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to become a part of our journey. Like this video to honor Buford's bravery. Share it with someone who believes in the power of loyalty and compassion. And don't forget to subscribe, because here we tell stories that matter. Real emotions. Real lives. True heroes. Click the bell icon so you never miss a moment that inspires. And leave a comment below. We'd love to hear how Buford's story made you feel. Thank you for watching. This is Animal Stories Chanel, where every story is a feeling that stays with you.